This is how the new DJI Pocket 3 performs in a studio environment using two compact lights and a microphone connected directly to the camera. Just for comparison, here is how the Sony ZV-E1 with the Sony 20mm f1.8 performs next to it. This camera and lens costs $3,000 compared to $520, and I think these cameras look relatively similar, especially in terms of colors, but of course the depth of field is different. But if I really want, I can add fake blurry background to the Pocket 3, which will make these cameras look even more similar. Also, here is how the Pocket 3 looks straight out of the camera without any color grading, and now with color grading. Anyhow, let me share with you the camera settings, gear, and color grading process method I use to achieve this look with the Pocket 3. Starting with the gear, the first item is the Boya BYK4 USB-C microphone adapter, which allows me to connect my DAT VMic D4 shotgun microphone to the Pocket 3. I've positioned the VMic D4 slightly out of frame so it won't be visible in the shot and as close as possible to me to get the absolute best sound quality. In terms of lighting, I'm using only two lights in this shot. The first one is my key light, the Colbor CL60M with a 60 by 90 centimeters softbox. I've positioned it at about 30 degrees from the camera, slightly above me, pointing downwards, and I have set its brightness to about 50% to reduce the ISO on the Pocket 3 to 100 to get the least amount of noise in the shot. As for the second light, I'm using the Ulanzi 40-watt light, which is mounted on my curtain rail. It's set to 100% brightness and it's pointing at the ceiling to increase the overall exposure in the room and make the background a bit brighter. Just for comparison, here is how it looks without the background light, and now with the background light, I think it makes a massive difference. Moving on to the camera settings, I set the resolution and frame rate to 4K 25p to get the highest image quality. Next, I set the white balance to 5500 Kelvin to match the color temperature of my key light. Then in the image adjustment menu, I choose costume and set the sharpness to -2 and noise reduction to -1. I prefer to add sharpness during post-production, and I think -1 noise reduction is the sweet spot on the Action 4 and also on the Pocket 3. Then I set the focus mode to continuous because I am moving in the frame, the glamour effect to off because I don't want any weird overlay effects, the color to D-Log M to get the widest dynamic range and the most flexibility in post-production when color grading, and the microphone gain to -5 because it's very close to me. In terms of exposure, I set it to manual with a shutter speed of 1/50 to get the most exposure without affecting motion blur in the image, and I set the ISO to 100 to get a reasonable amount of exposure without negatively impacting noise performance. If you have very powerful lighting, you can lower the ISO to 50 to get even better noise performance, but unfortunately my lights are not that powerful. And finally, for the gimbal settings, I've set the rotational speed to default and gimbal mode to follow. Now let's do a quick image quality comparison with this talking head angle between this camera, the Pocket 3, the ZV-E1 with the 20mm f1.8, GoPro 12, and Action 4. So first of all, let's start with the DJI Action 4. I'm going to put the settings that I use for this camera somewhere on the screen. And I think this camera also performs really well in a studio environment if you have decent amount of lighting. And now I have switched to the GoPro Hero 12. I'm also going to put the settings for this camera somewhere on the screen. And I think this camera doesn't look as good in this kind of environment as the Pocket 3 or the Action 4 because GoPro cameras really struggle in low light conditions. And finally, this is how the Sony ZV-E1 with the 20mm f1.8 looks like in comparison to the DJI Action 4, Pocket 3, and the GoPro Hero 12. I think this camera obviously is going to look the best, but it's also the most expensive at $3,000 including the lens. And now again, here is how the Pocket 3 looks like in comparison to all these cameras. Obviously, I think the ZVE1 wins in terms of image quality. Second place, I think, is the Pocket 3. It's very close and it's very impressive actually how good the image quality is on the Pocket 3. Then the third place, I think, is the Action 4. And the last and the fourth one is the GoPro Hero 12. Let me know down below which one you think is the best and why. And now let's move on to color grading. I want to show you how I color graded this shot with the Pocket 3. So I'm now inside Final Cut Pro and I have here this clip on the timeline from the Pocket 3. Let me show you exactly what I did in terms of color grading to make this clip look the way you see it right now. So first of all, I have used the Color Finale Pro plugin to color grade all of the footage in this video, and I'm not sponsored by them or anything like that. I actually bought the plugin myself last week. They had like a sale and I decided to buy it because I felt like I reached the limit with the built-in tools inside Final Cut Pro for color grading. I think this tool has a bit more advanced features and it's a bit more simple to use for advanced color grading. So let's start. First of all, I added 15% of sharpness because I reduced the sharpness in camera. Now let me disable everything here and I'm gonna start from the beginning. So first of all, I have adjusted the exposure and added some contrast with curves, and I used the Luma plus RGB mode because I only wanted to affect the exposure, the luminance, and not the saturation. I prefer to control the saturation in a separate node or layer. Then I increased the saturation with color wheels. I just added 1.42 global saturation and that's it. And fortunately, I didn't have to adjust the white balance because the colors from the Pocket 3 are super accurate. Then I slightly adjusted the skin tones by increasing the saturation in the skin tone colors and also slightly adjusting the hue of the skin tones. Next thing I did is I added a mask, an ellipse mask on me in the middle here, and then I added curves for the outer part of the mask and reduced the exposure to make the background a bit darker. And then in the inner part of the mask, I increased the exposure just slightly to make myself a bit more separated from the background. Next thing I did is I added a teal and orange color grade by isolating my skin tones. Here is the before, here is the after. So I added an HSL mask here. Let me show you exactly how it looks like. Let me remove this blur here. So basically I isolated my skin tones as much as possible. Maybe I'm going to adjust a bit more now actually. Let me see if I can make it look a bit better. And I also added about 5-6% of blur to make the transition between the color grade and my skin tones a bit smoother. That's one reason I bought this plugin, because if you use the built-in tools inside Final Cut Pro and you want to make an HSL mask and you're really pushing the colors, sometimes you can get artifacts, but here you have this blur effect to make a nice transition between the color grade and the HSL mask. And also I reduced the overall intensity of the teal and orange grade to 85% from 100. Then I used log wheels to clean up the shadows a little bit because I felt like I had too much teal in the shadows. Let me zoom into about 200% so you can clearly see the difference. So look at the door here. This is before and after. Let me go to another part of the shot. Look here, before, a bit teal in here, and now it looks a bit more neutral. A very minor adjustment, but it goes a long way when you add all of these adjustments in a color grade. And basically how I cleaned up the shadows is by pushing the shadow slider wheel here towards the opposite color of teal, which is basically red and magenta. Then I added this 6 vectors tool, which is basically like HSL tool but a bit easier to use. And I adjusted the color of my t-shirt here, as you can see, and also my skin and a bit of the background. I played around also with the greens here with the plant in the background, but it's a very minor adjustment, nothing really crazy here. And here I desaturated the shadows even more with saturation versus luminance by selecting the shadow area and pushing it down. And finally I added this fake bokeh effect, which actually looks pretty cool. This is with the effect, without the effect, with the effect, without the effect. a pretty significant difference. And to not affect myself, I added a mask, an ellipse mask, just so it only will affect the background basically. So this is again the before. Look at the plant here, the door and the computer, and after. It's very minor adjustment, but it definitely adds to the overall quality of the Pocket 3. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you have any questions or comments, let me know down below. I'm going to make a lot more content with this fantastic camera, and I guess I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for the support. Salute.